Behind a half-open door in a São Paulo mansion, Sarah heard the man she was meant to marry laugh and swear he'd rather go bankrupt than share her name. The crystal glass trembled in her hand. The smile she wore minutes later, under the flash of cameras, was sharper than any blade. She would make him fall, then she would destroy him. What she didn't know was that someone had been playing that same game for 10 years, against her. If this story is already touching your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence means the world to us. The Montero mansion was lit up like something out of a magazine spread. Chandeliers dripped gold light across the marble. A string quartet played somewhere near the staircase, one of those pieces that sounds expensive without being memorable. And São Paulo's elite drifted through the rooms in silk, tailored black and too much perfume. Outside the iron gates, photographers leaned into each other like pigeons, their flashes stuttering against the facade. Inside, champagne glasses caught the light and held it, small and cold and bright. Sarah Albuquerque moved through the crowd the way she always did, like she'd been born inside it. She had been. Emerald satin clung to her in a way that made men forget what they were saying mid-sentence, and her dark hair was pinned to one side, showing off the curve of her neck and a single diamond at her ear. Nothing more. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny. She kissed cheeks. She held her champagne by the stem the way her grandmother had taught her at 12, fingertips barely grazing the crystal. Never your palm, Sarah, never the palm. Underneath all of it, something was winding tighter. It was her third gala in 3 weeks, and she was tired in that specific bone-deep way that comes from smiling at people you don't like. She wanted air. Just air. 5 minutes of somewhere that wasn't here. She slipped down a side hallway, heels silent on the long Persian runner. She knew this house. Knew it better than her own, actually. She'd played hide-and-seek in these corridors as a kid, back when her father and Levi's father were still partners instead of whatever they were now. Enemies was too clean a word for it. Competitors, maybe. Two men who spent decades not speaking to each other in the same city. She stopped at a crossing of hallways and considered. The library would be empty. She turned toward it. That's when she heard him. His voice drifted through a half-open door. The old study with the leather armchairs and the smell of tobacco someone had quit 15 years ago. She should have kept walking. She would have, if she hadn't caught her own name, sharp as a splinter, and her feet just stopped, like someone had pulled a wire tight inside her chest. Sarah Albuquerque? Levi's voice, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man holding whiskey. Please. Another man laughed. Claudio, maybe. Oh, come on. Everyone knows the merger makes sense. 2 houses, 1 contract. You'd be an idiot not to. I'd rather go bankrupt, Levi said, and there was a smile in it, than marry that arrogant woman. The laughter that followed was soft, private, the kind of laughter men let out when they're sure no one is listening. Sarah didn't move. She was suddenly strangely aware of the champagne flute in her hand, the weight of it, how the crystal had gone warm against her fingers, how the bubbles were still rising, busy and oblivious, toward a surface that no longer mattered. Her heart did something she didn't have a word for, not the quick flutter of being embarrassed, something slower, heavier, a beat with teeth in it, arrogant. She turned the word around in her mouth without opening her lips. Behind the door, ice clicked against glass. Levi was saying something else now, softer, and she only caught pieces. Terrible heiress, every dinner a negotiation. Can you imagine waking up to that mouth every morning? And the men laughed again, the way men laugh when they think the world was built for their amusement. Sarah stepped back from the door, slowly, carefully, the way you step away from something sleeping. She found the small bathroom at the end of the hall, went in and locked the door, set the champagne on the marble counter, where it caught the light and kept doing its bright, pointless work. She looked at herself in the mirror, flushed cheeks, eyes gone the color of storm glass, lipstick still perfect, because lipstick that expensive doesn't have the decency to smudge. Arrogant, she whispered. And then, this was the strange part, she smiled. Not the smile from the door. This one was quieter, sharper at the edges, the smile of a woman who had just decided something and was not going to undecide it. She reapplied her lipstick. pressed her lips together, touched the earring at her left lobe, the one that always worked itself loose. When she walked back into the ballroom, she didn't walk. She glided. She crossed the floor like the floor had been waiting for her. And when Levi Montero turned, mid-conversation, and caught her eyes across the room, she gave him everything. The tilt of her head, the soft mouth, the gaze held just a beat too long. A lit match held in the open air. Levi blinked. Once, then lifted his glass in her direction, the old tired gesture between old tired families. Sarah lifted hers in return. Something clicked into place inside her chest. Small, final. The sound of a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She didn't know yet what kind of door it would open. She only knew she was going to walk through it, and that he would never hear her coming. 3 weeks later, the city was sitting under one of those grey, sideways rains that doesn't cool anything down. It just makes the traffic worse. Avenida Paulista was a long strip of taillights and wet asphalt, red bleeding into black, the drivers leaning on their horns like it would change something. Up on the 28th floor of a glass tower near MASP, a conference room had been prepared with the kind of care normally reserved for state funerals. Mahogany table, 12 chairs. A pitcher of water nobody was going to touch. 3 lawyers on each side. 2 families who had spent 10 years pretending the other didn't exist, now sitting in the same room because the economy had stopped caring what either of them wanted. Sarah was 4 minutes late, on purpose. She wore cream. A sharp-shouldered suit, silk blouse the color of old pearls, heels that made a particular patient sound on the marble outside the door. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot, and she'd put on her grandmother's pearls, the small, almost invisible ones, the kind you only noticed if you were close enough to count them. She wanted to look like a woman with nothing to prove, which was, of course, the best way to prove something. Levi was already there. He was standing at the window, his back to the room, hands in his pockets, watching the avenue below. Navy suit, no tie. The top button of his shirt undone. When she walked in, he didn't turn right away. He let the moment stretch, let her cross half the room before he looked over his shoulder, and the look he gave her was so carefully bored it was almost funny. Almost. Miss Albuquerque. Mr. Montero. The lawyers stood up politely. Someone pulled out her chair. Sarah sat, crossed her legs, smoothed a crease that wasn't there. Levi came to the table and unbuttoned his jacket as he lowered himself into the seat directly across from her. Close enough that she caught the scent of him before she could stop herself. Clean cotton. Something woodier underneath. Cedar, maybe. Smoke from a fire that had gone out hours ago. She kept her face still. "Shall we?" one of the lawyers said, and started sliding documents across the table. The terms had been hammered out in rooms neither of them had been in. Both empires were bleeding. The Albuquerque textile holdings 1 bad quarter from selling off half the Northeast operations. The Montero real estate portfolio carrying debt that made even their most patient creditors start returning calls at odd hours. Separately, they were sinking. Together, the banks would lend them another 18 months. The solution was absurd, and exactly the kind of thing their fathers would have agreed to over a single glass of whiskey. Marriage. 2 years. Clean cut. Joint press release, joint public appearances, joint address. At the end of the contract, an amicable separation, a quiet division of assets, and everyone goes back to their lives about 500 million richer. Sarah flipped through the pages without really reading them. She'd read them. Every comma. Twice. "There's a cohabitation clause," Levi said. "I noticed. Same address for the duration." "Noticed that too." His jaw moved. Just a little. "You don't have concerns?" She lifted her eyes from the contract and let them settle on his, held them, kept holding. "Should I?" Something shifted in his expression, just a fraction, the tiny, invisible recalibration of a man who had walked in, expecting a different opponent. The lawyer on Sarah's left cleared his throat and started walking everyone through the financial schedule. Sarah listened with half her head. The other half was watching Levi's hands. He had the pen between his fingers, turning it end over end, a small restless motion she wasn't sure he knew he was making. He wore no ring. His watch was old. His father's, she remembered suddenly, from some Christmas spread in Veja 15 years ago. The strap had been replaced. The face hadn't. She wondered briefly, meanly, if he'd practiced what he was going to say when they handed him the pen. "Sign already, Albuquerque." He said it out of nowhere, halfway through the lawyer's explanation of the dispute resolution clause. He was smiling. It didn't make it up to his eyes. "Before I change my mind." Sarah smiled back. It was the second time that month a smile of hers had come with teeth. "I wouldn't change mine, Montero." She took the pen the lawyer slid toward her, uncapped it slowly, held it above the page. "I wouldn't give you the satisfaction." Their eyes locked across the table, and for a long second everything, the lawyers, the rain against the glass, the soft mechanical hum of the air conditioning, just dropped out of the room. There was something in the way he was looking at her. Not anger, not quite amusement, something more complicated than that. A man trying to read a document in a language he thought he knew and finding a word that didn't belong. She signed her name. Clean. The small loop at the end of the H, the way her grandmother had taught her. She slid the pages across. Levi took the pen from her fingers, and for one single startling second their fingertips brushed. Skin. Skin. Barely a heartbeat of contact. He didn't look up, but something in his breath caught, so small it might have been nothing, and Sarah felt her stomach do a slow, unpleasant turn that had absolutely nothing to do with the coffee she'd skipped that morning. He signed. The lawyers started clapping softly, as if they'd accomplished something. Levi looked up at her across the table. The pen was still in his hand. "Congratulations, Mrs. Montero," he said. Quieter than she expected. Sarah didn't blink. "Don't," she said. "Get used to it." The house in Jardins had been built in the 50s by an architect who apparently believed a kitchen should be its own kind of cathedral. Vaulted ceiling. A long stretch of pale marble along one wall. Windows that opened onto a courtyard full of yellow ipé trees, all of them dropping petals at the moment, slow and steady, like the garden was quietly shedding something it didn't need anymore. Sarah came downstairs on the first morning in white silk. It wasn't a performance, not entirely. It was what she'd grabbed from the suitcase her assistant had packed at 2 in the morning, after the movers finished hauling the last of her things into a house she had never, in any version of her life, imagined she'd live in. The silk robe had just been the easiest thing to find. It fell to her knees, tie loose, and her hair was still wet from the shower, pushed back off her face. No makeup, just her grandmother's pearls, because she couldn't remember taking them off in the first place. She paused in the kitchen doorway. 1 second, maybe less. Levi was already at the table, sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading Valor Economico with a cup of coffee at his left hand and half a slice of toast on the plate in front of him, untouched. He didn't look up. The fold of the newspaper was almost aggressively precise. She caught the exact second he noticed her. It traveled through his knuckles first, a single, tight pull on the edge of the paper, hard enough that the corner creased. She saw it. She didn't let anything cross her face. "Morning," she said, light as the silk, and crossed to the espresso machine. "Morning." He still didn't look up. The maid had left a pot of coffee on a silver tray, already waiting, but Sarah ignored it on purpose and pressed the button on the machine. The grinder came to life, loud, obnoxious, and filled the room. She took her time, picked out a small white cup, let the smell of dark coffee work its way across the marble. Somewhere out in the garden, a bird she couldn't name kept hitting the same 2 notes over and over, like it was making a case. She carried her cup to the table and sat at the far end. Not the seat next to him, the one facing him. 8 feet of polished oak between them, with a fruit bowl in the middle that neither of them was going to touch. She took a slow sip. "Is there something you want to say, Montero?" He turned a page. "No." "You've been reading the same headline for 2 minutes." A beat. The corner of his mouth did something. Barely a smile gone before it had committed to being one. "I read slowly. You read company reports in 10 languages at the speed of light. You finished your doctoral dissertation in 8 months. You looked me up? I married you." I did due diligence. He lowered the paper, looked at her, long, level, unreadable. There was a shadow along his jaw from not shaving yet, a detail she hadn't prepared for, and his eyes were that specific dark brown that goes almost black in strong light. In the kitchen's morning glare, they were black. "You're going to wear that at breakfast every day? Do you have a problem with silk? I have a problem with—" He stopped, caught himself, picked up his coffee instead. "Never mind. No, please, finish the sentence." "I have a problem," he said carefully, "with people weaponizing their wardrobe at 8 in the morning." She laughed, not on purpose. A short, surprised sound that came out before she could stop it, and she was immediately annoyed with herself because she was not supposed to find him funny. That wasn't in the plan. "Noted," she said, and took another sip. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that sits on the surface of a pool before somebody jumps in. Down the hall, one of the housekeepers was running water. A car horn went off, muted somewhere out on the street. The IP petals kept falling. Levi folded the paper, set it aside. "Sarah, Levi, this is going to be—" He paused, rubbed the back of his neck. "Unpleasant, for both of us, if we don't set some ground rules." "Oh? And what rules did you have in mind?" "Separate bedrooms, obviously. Obviously. We share the address. We don't share the schedule. I'll have breakfast at 7, you can have yours at 8. If we're expected at something together, we coordinate the car. Otherwise, we move independently." She tilted her head slightly. "You've thought about this a lot. I've had 3 weeks. So have I. And what did you come up with?" She held the cup to her mouth for a moment and didn't answer. She was watching his hands again. Long fingers, a small pale nick on his left thumb, a healed scar. Old. She wondered when he'd cut himself, what he'd been doing, why she was wondering at all, and why it bothered her that she was. "I'm going to reach for the coffee pot now," she said lightly. "What?" "Just letting you know." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because she wanted to see him try to predict her and fail. Maybe because she was already tired of his rules. She reached across for the silver pot at the same moment he reached to slide it closer to her, and their fingers met on the handle. A real touch this time. Not a brush, not an accident. Skin on skin. Warm. The metal between their palms turned into nothing. Both of them pulled back, Levi a fraction faster. His hand dropped to the edge of the table and gripped it, not hard, but hard enough that she saw the white come into his knuckles before he let go. "Sorry." His voice had dropped a full octave. "Don't be. I know what you were doing." He didn't answer. He looked at her mouth, then caught himself and looked away, and she watched the whole thing happen. She poured her second cup. The sound of coffee against porcelain was suddenly very loud. The bird outside had stopped. Levi was looking somewhere just past her shoulder now, and for the first time that morning, he looked, not uncertain exactly, unsettled, like someone who'd stepped onto a floor that wasn't as steady as they remembered. She'd found the first crack in the armor. She didn't smile. She knew better. But something small and mean turned over in her chest, and it felt exactly like winning, and nothing at all like she'd imagined it would. The invitation had come a week earlier, embossed in gold foil, announcing a corporate gala at a hotel overlooking Parque Ibirapuera. One of those evenings where people who didn't want to see each other spent the whole night pretending they'd been hoping to run into one another. Sarah read it twice, dropped it on the kitchen counter, drove to her tailor's the next morning. She didn't tell Donna Regina what she wanted. She just pulled a swatch out of her bag and laid it on the table. Red, not bright, not the red of a slap or a warning light. The deep, slow red of a pomegranate split open on a plate. The kind of red that doesn't ask for attention. It just takes it. The dress arrived Friday afternoon in a black garment bag, and Sarah spent longer than she'd admit staring at it on the hanger, nearly backless. A single thin gold chain running down the spine, like a signature at the bottom of a document. Sharp neckline. A hem that moved when she did. When she tried it on and stood in front of the mirror, she just looked at herself for a long minute and thought, this is the one. The one for what? She didn't let herself finish. She'd been doing that lately, not finishing sentences inside her own head. The house was quiet that night until about 7. She'd sent word through the housekeeper. Coming down at 7:30, the car should be waiting. Mr. Montero was welcome to go ahead if he preferred. He hadn't. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs when she came down. Tuxedo clean, bow tie already knotted. One hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone, scrolling at something with his thumb. He looked up, and the phone, for about 2 full seconds, forgot what it was for. She watched his eyes make the whole trip, her face first, then the neckline, then, and he pulled himself back so fast it was almost funny, back to her face. His jaw moved once. He slid the phone into his pocket without looking at the screen. "Ready?" he said. "Are you?" He didn't answer that one. She took the last 3 steps slowly. He held out his arm the way men do at these things, a small automatic courtesy that wasn't supposed to mean anything, except his hand didn't land on her elbow. It slid just an inch or 2 to the small of her back, the bare part, and stayed there. The heat of his palm came through that thin gold chain as if it weren't even in the way. "You're trying to kill me," he said, almost to himself. "Not yet." She tilted her face up toward his, close enough to catch the cedar off his skin again, stronger this time, with something cleaner underneath. "When I am, you'll know." His fingers pressed briefly into her spine, then let go. The ride was 20 minutes. Neither of them said a word. He sat with his elbow on the door and his fist against his mouth and watched the city slide past the window. Sarah looked at her phone, which had gone dark 2 traffic lights ago, and pretended she was reading something. The gala was on the rooftop of a hotel on Avenida República do Líbano, glass walls on 3 sides, the park glowing green below, the skyline doing its best postcard impression, a jazz quartet in one corner, waiters in white, 400 of the usual faces, the usual smiles, the usual careful kisses that landed an inch away from the cheek. She made her entrance exactly the way she'd rehearsed, slow, not hurrying. And she felt it work. The small ripple of heads turning, the half-second stutter in the music of conversation, the way Levi's hand tightened at her back just once before he let go. She smiled up at him, too sweetly. "Go mingle, meu amor," she murmured, and peeled away. She worked the room for an hour. She laughed at the jokes of an investment banker named Raphael, who had the kind of careful charm that never quite made it past your skin. She let an architect she'd known back in college touch her elbow while he told her some story about Lisbon. She leaned in close to a board member from her father's old firm, close enough that he had to drop his voice to answer her, and laughed at whatever he said, as though it was the wittiest thing she'd heard all year. Across the room she could feel Levi the way you feel a sudden drop in temperature. He was by the bar, one hand in his pocket, the other wrapped around a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. His face was perfect. His eyes weren't. Every time she laughed, his grip on the glass tightened another fraction. At one point somebody clapped him on the shoulder, and he didn't even turn his head. She crossed the room, not toward him, past him. She brushed his arm on the way by, the barest contact, not even a full touch, and kept walking out toward the balcony. He followed within 30 seconds. It was cooler outside than she'd expected. The breeze off the park smelled like wet grass and night jasmine, and São Paulo did what São Paulo does, hummed on beneath them endlessly, like something that didn't know how to stop. She was leaning against the railing when she felt him come up behind her. "Having fun?" "Enormous amounts." "I noticed." "Did you?" She turned. He was closer than she'd thought. Close enough that she could see the small vein in his temple, the one that had apparently been working all night. He looked at her mouth, looked away, looked back, and this time didn't bother looking away. "Sarah." "If you laugh at one more thing that isn't funny, I'm going to do something we're both going to regret." She tilted her head. "Barely." "Like what?" He didn't answer. He just reached up, slow, almost unwilling, and brushed a loose strand of hair back from her cheek with the back of one knuckle. That was all. 2 seconds of skin. The back of one finger. Sarah's heart did something it absolutely did not have permission to do. She laughed, soft. "Careful, Montero, people will talk." "Let them." Her breath caught, and she hated him for noticing. She stepped past him before it could become anything else, back into the warm, gold-lit room, back into the safety of 400 witnesses. And when she glanced over her shoulder from the doorway, he was still out on the balcony, both hands on the railing now, head bowed, the picture of a man trying to remember what he'd been about to say. She smiled. It wasn't sharp this time, it was something else. She didn't have a name for it yet. They got back a little past 1. The car pulled through the iron gate, and Sarah stepped out before the driver could come around, barefoot, heels dangling from 2 fingers, the other hand hitching up the hem of the red dress so it wouldn't drag through the gravel. The temperature had dropped somewhere between the hotel and the house, and the wind had that particular São Paulo autumn bite to it, sharper than it should have been. The kind of cold that forgets it's supposed to be mild this time of year. She didn't go inside. She followed the stone path around the side of the house, the little walkway her mother-in-law had designed and never once visited, and out to the back veranda that looked over the garden. Levi had paid the driver and was pulling off his jacket when he realized she wasn't in the house. She didn't hear him come out. She was leaning on the railing, elbows on the cold stone, not really looking at anything. The dark shape of the jabuticaba tree, the pale line of the wall at the end of the lawn, the pool cover glinting wet under the moonlight. Her feet were freezing. The wind was doing things with her hair. She felt it and she didn't. Her body had been one single tight wire for the last 5 hours, and now it had gone loose in a way that almost looked like being tired, except she wasn't tired. She was somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't given herself permission to go. Then the weight dropped over her shoulders, a tuxedo jacket, warm, heavier than she expected, still carrying the heat of his body in the lining. The smell of him came down around her. Cedar, the faint ghost of whiskey he hadn't actually drunk, something soap-clean underneath. And her stomach did the turn it kept doing lately. The one she was getting tired of pretending she couldn't feel. She turned. He was closer than she'd thought. Not close enough to touch, just close enough that she could see his face in the moonlight. And it wasn't the face she remembered from the rooftop, not the man who'd brushed her hair back with the back of a knuckle. This Levi looked tired. Somewhere between the car and the veranda, the careful version of him had slipped off. His tie was loose. The top button of his shirt was open, small shadows under his eyes. She had never seen him look tired before. It did something to her she hadn't planned for. "You're going to get sick." His voice came out rougher than she expected. No edge to it, no arrogance, just a thing a man says when he's worried about something he's not supposed to be worried about. "I'm not cold. You're shaking." She looked down. She was, a little. "Oh." He didn't say anything for a while. His hand was still on her shoulder, adjusting the jacket, and then it just stayed there. He didn't take it away. His thumb moved once, slow, across the curve of her shoulder, like he wasn't aware of it, or was aware, and had stopped pretending otherwise. Sarah forgot to breathe for a second. "Levi." "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't say my name like that." "Like what?" "Like you mean it." Something inside her chest cracked, hairline thin, and she couldn't tell if what leaked out was triumph or panic. It was supposed to be triumph. She had put triumph on the schedule. But there was his thumb still moving at her shoulder, and there was that worn-out look in his eyes, and there was the smell of his cologne wrapped around her, and not one of those things had been in the plan. She was supposed to be driving. She wasn't sure, suddenly, who was driving. "You're tired," she said, instead of anything else. He made a short sound, half a laugh, no humor in it. "You have no idea." "I have some idea." "You don't." "Tell me then." He looked at her a long moment. The wind lifted a piece of her hair and dropped it against her cheek. His hand started to move toward it. She watched him start the gesture, and then he caught himself. His hand went back to his side. "Go to bed, Sarah." "Why?" "Because it's late." "That's not why." "No." "Then why?" He didn't answer right away. He was looking at her the way people look at an open flame, close enough to feel the heat, far enough not to go up with it. His jaw kept working. She could see the beat of his pulse at his throat, under the open collar, and it matched the strange rhythm happening somewhere just under her own collarbone. "Because," he said finally, "if I stand out here with you for one more minute, I'm going to do something I can't take back, and I'm trying, Sarah, I'm trying really hard." The honesty of it landed in her chest and knocked something loose. She didn't move. For a long second, neither did he. The wind pushed through the ipe branches at the far end of the garden, and somewhere above them, a small plane crossed the sky on its way to Congonhas, the red blink of it, tracking slowly across the dark. Her toes were numb. Her shoulders were warm. She was holding her breath the way you hold a glass of water you're trying not to spill. Then he stepped forward, slowly, not to kiss her, not to touch her, not like that, just close enough that their chests almost brushed, and he reached down, careful, and tugged the jacket tighter around her shoulders. His hands ran once down the lapels, pressing the fabric against her collarbones. He did it the way you close a coat on a child. He did it the way you hold yourself together with both hands. "Good night," he said. His voice had gone soft, which was worse than anything else he'd done all evening. He stepped back. Then he turned and walked into the house, and Sarah stood there on the cold stone in his jacket, listening to his footsteps fade through the kitchen and down the hall, and for the first time since the night she'd stood behind a half-open door with a glass of champagne going warm in her hand, really, honestly, she didn't know what she was doing anymore. She pulled the jacket tighter. It was still warm. She stayed out there a long time. It was supposed to be a day trip. There was a property out in Paraty, a beach house that had been in the Montero family for 3 generations, the kind of place you only saw in old photographs with everyone squinting into the sun. And the family lawyers had been on Levi's case about it for months. Sell, renovate, turn it into a rental. The roof was starting to go. So on a Thursday morning in late April, with a press conference cancelled and a meeting pushed to the following week, Levi looked up at her over the rim of his coffee and said, "I have to drive to Paraty today. Come with me." She didn't look up from the paper at first. Why? Because if I have to make this decision alone, I'm going to make a bad one. That wasn't the real reason. They both knew it wasn't the real reason, but it was a good enough reason to say out loud, and Sarah set her cup down and said, 15 minutes. They took his car, not the driver. His own, an old silver SUV he only drove on weekends, one of those cars with a thermos in the cup holder and sand still caught under the floor mats. He drove. She put her feet up on the dashboard once they cleared the city, and he looked away, didn't say anything about it. The conversation was easier than it had any right to be. They ended up talking about things they never talked about. His brother, who'd moved to Lisbon 3 years ago. Her mother's second marriage, which she always summarized as a financial event. A film neither of them had finished. A song she hated that he liked and another he liked that she couldn't stand. Somewhere past Ubatuba, she laughed at a story he told about his father, and then fell quiet because it was the first time she'd heard him say the word father without the small armored edge his voice usually got. He was telling her real things. She didn't quite know where to put them. They hit Paraty a little after 2, pulled over at a fisherman's bar for lunch, and got back on the road around 4. The sky had gone the color of old pewter by then. Levi squinted up at it and said, "We should have left earlier." Sarah said, "We've got time." Neither of them was right. The rain started 20 minutes from the turnoff. It didn't build. There was no warning. The sky just opened, and water came down in sheets thick enough that the wipers gave up halfway through each pass. Levi slowed again. And then, maybe 10 kilometers from the house, the car made a small, miserable ticking sound. 2 lights came up on the dash that Sarah didn't recognize, and the engine went. He let it roll to the shoulder, flicked on the hazards, rested his forehead against the steering wheel for a long second. "Please tell me you know how to fix this." "I do not know how to fix this." "Phone?" "No signal." "You?" "Nothing." They sat there a minute while the rain hammered the roof. The windshield was just water. Outside there was nothing but green on both sides of the road, Atlantic forest pressed up against the shoulder, and a single yellow sign pointing toward a pousada around the next bend. They could make out a smear of light through the downpour, maybe 200 meters. "Run for it?" I'm wearing sandals. I'll carry you. Absolutely not. She pulled her jacket up over her head, and they got out. By the time they reached the posada, a small wooden place with a wide porch and a dog asleep on a folded towel, they were both soaked through, water in her hair, his shirt glued to his shoulders. The woman at the desk took one look at them and laughed out loud, and then she said the Portuguese word Sarah should have seen coming from the moment the engine died. Temos quarto. Just the one. Of course. Of course there was just the one. The room was small, double bed against the far wall. A window that rattled every time the wind came off the mountain. A single overhead light. No sofa, no armchair. Just a tiny desk and a wicker basket of towels under it. The woman brought them dry shirts, a plain white cotton one for Levi, a loose t-shirt with a faded parity logo for Sarah, and a tin pot of something hot that smelled like ginger and cachaça. They drank it standing by the window, Sarah with a towel over her shoulders on top of the t-shirt, her hair still dripping down her back, and Levi barefoot on the wood floor, and neither of them looked at the bed. "I'll sleep on the floor." "Don't be ridiculous, it's freezing, we're adults." Sarah. "Both of us, against opposite walls. Pillow between us. We've shared an address for 2 months. We can share 6 hours. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay. They got into the bed fully dressed, backs against opposite walls. A stiff little pillow shoved into the space between them, doing absolutely nothing. Light off. Rain still pounding the window. The whole small room smelled like wet cotton and pine and the faint softened trace of his cologne, diluted by rain, more human. For about 20 minutes, neither of them moved. Then the thunder hit. Close. Close enough that the window rattled in its frame, and Sarah's whole body flinched, and without thinking and without choosing, without permission, her hand shot out across the bed in the dark and found his. His fingers closed around hers before she'd even finished reaching. Not hesitant, not searching, immediate, like he'd been waiting for her to do exactly that. Neither of them said anything. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the pillow, and his breath was coming faster than hers, faster, a little uneven, and for some reason that small detail almost undid her. That he was the one more shaken, that she'd been matching her breathing to his and hadn't even noticed. "Sarah," he said into the dark, "don't." "Okay." His thumb moved once, slowly, across her knuckles. She didn't pull her hand back. She fell asleep like that, hand in his hand. Pillow between them. Rain still coming. Sometime in the night the pillow slid to the floor, and when she opened her eyes again the window had gone grey and she was warm, and she realized, with a small, quiet jolt that felt nothing like she'd expected it to feel, that her forehead was pressed against his. His hand was still holding hers. Their breathing had come into sync somewhere while they slept. Slow. Even. Together. She didn't move. She didn't want to. And it was in that exact second, with the smell of him in the air and his forehead against hers, and a single bird starting up somewhere outside the window, that Sarah Albuquerque understood her plan, her long, careful, beautifully engineered plan, had started coming apart a long time ago, maybe from the start, maybe before that. She closed her eyes again. He didn't wake up. She stayed exactly where she was. They made it back to São Paulo the next afternoon, once the tow truck showed up, and the mechanic got under the hood and said alternator, and 2 days at least. A rental got them home. On the drive, neither of them mentioned the posada. Neither of them mentioned the forehead against a forehead, or the hand that had stayed in another hand through an entire thunderstorm. They talked about roof estimates, whether to sell, whether to keep it for the cousins. It was easier that way. For the next 5 days, Sarah did what she had always done when something got too close to the bone. She doubled down. She came to breakfast in louder colors, stayed out later, laughed with her phone pressed to her ear at things her college friends said on speaker, making sure she passed through the living room exactly when Levi was trying to read something. She slammed doors that did not need to be slammed. She made sure her perfume reached the kitchen before she did. She made him feel her as on purpose, in every room she walked through, and then she made him feel her absence also on purpose, in every room she didn't. It should have worked. It wasn't. Every time she brushed past him in a hallway, her own heart did something foolish. Every time she caught him looking away a beat too fast, a small, sick pull started up under her ribs that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with how much she had begun to want him, quietly, to look back. It was Tuesday, almost Wednesday, 2 in the morning. She couldn't sleep. She lay in the big guest bed that had become her bed and stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes. And when the ceiling declined to offer any explanations, she got up, pulled a thin robe over her sleep shorts and tank top, and went downstairs for water. The kitchen light was on. She stopped in the doorway. Levi was at the counter, barefoot, no shirt, dark sweatpants hanging low on his hips. Hair a mess, still wet at the ends, like he'd gotten out of the shower an hour ago and not been able to lie back down. He had one of those glass bottles of sparkling water in his hand and was drinking straight from it, head tilted back, the long line of his throat working as he swallowed. He hadn't heard her. She watched him for exactly 1 second. She hated herself for the length of that second. Then she leaned against the doorframe and said, lighter than she felt, "Insomnia suits you, Montero." He choked on the water, coughed, set the bottle down on the counter with a small, sharp clink. Jesus. Jumpy tonight. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Sarah, what? Getting water. It's 2 a.m. That's when the water is. He looked at her, really looked this time, not the quick, controlled glance he'd perfected. A long, undefended look that started at her face, went down to the robe that had slipped open somewhere between the stairs and the kitchen and that she hadn't bothered to fix, and came back up again, and stayed. The kitchen went very quiet. In the hallway, the grandfather clock did its old patient work. The fridge hummed. Out on the street, a car passed and was gone. "What are you doing, Sarah?" "I told you I'm—" "No." "No? What are you doing?" She laughed, a short, brittle thing. "Is this a philosophical question at 2 in the morning, Levi? Because I'm not really in the—" "You slammed the bathroom door tonight. You've been slamming doors for 5 days. Yesterday you laughed at something Carolina said on speakerphone for 20 minutes in the hallway while I was on a call with Singapore, and Carolina is not even slightly funny." "Maybe she is. She is not. Maybe I like her anyway." "Sarah." "What? What are you trying to do?" The question landed in the wrong part of her chest. It landed in the part that still remembered a small wooden room and a hand that had closed around hers before she'd finished reaching, and she couldn't answer. Not honestly. So she did what she always did when she couldn't answer honestly. She went sharp. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." "It's late. I'm going back." "Don't." She stopped. He set the bottle down very slowly on the counter, and then he crossed the kitchen. 3 steps, not fast, not slow, just 3 deliberate steps across the cold Italian tile, and before she could think of what to say, he was there, close and warmer than the whole room, and his hands came up and cupped her face like he'd been waiting weeks to be allowed to do it. "Stop," he said, barely any voice behind it. "Just stop." Then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't any of the versions of him she'd rehearsed in her head. It was a kiss that had been trying to happen for longer than either of them had known, and when it finally landed, it came with everything underneath it, the cool taste of the water still on his mouth, the small catch of his breath, the slow pass of his thumb along her cheekbone, like he was checking that she was actually there. Her knees did something she refused to think about. Her hands came up without her permission and held onto the drawstring at his hips because she had to hold on to something, and she wasn't ready to hold on to him. The kiss broke, both of them breathing hard, foreheads together, the clock ticking on in the hallway slightly unkindly. "I wasn't," she started. "I know." "You don't." "I know, Sarah." "I hate you." "Okay. I hate you so much." "I know." She kissed him again. Or he kissed her. By the second time, she couldn't say whose fault it was. His hand slid up into her hair, and hers let go of the drawstring and went to his bare shoulder instead. And for a long stretch, the only sound in the kitchen was the quiet hush of 2 people who had been holding their breath for weeks, finally letting it go. And then her own head caught up with her. The small, cold voice that had been writing this plan since that first night behind a half-open door, the voice that had said, "Make him fall, then break him," stood up in the back of her mind and started shouting. She pulled back. Her hands were shaking. I have to... Sarah, I can't. Sarah, wait. She went. Up the stairs barefoot, as fast as she could go without calling it running, the hem of her robe snagging on her calf, into her room, locked the door, put her back against it. Her heart was doing something that couldn't possibly be good for her. Downstairs she listened. He didn't come after her. That was somehow worse. What she heard instead was the soft, flat thump of both his hands going down on the marble counter. Just once. The sound a man makes when he's trying to keep himself standing. Then nothing. She slid down the door and sat on the floor in the dark. And for the first time in 12 years, since her grandfather's funeral maybe, since before that, Sarah Albuquerque put her face in her hands and cried, quietly, furiously, because she finally understood all the way through that she was losing. Not him. The war she'd started. She was packed before the sun came up. Sarah moved through her bedroom in the blue half-light, the way a person moves when they're running from a fire they set themselves, pulling sweaters out of drawers, folding nothing, stuffing things into a weekend bag she'd bought in Milan 3 years ago and never used once. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She didn't want to see herself in the mirror. She already knew what she would look like. Swollen eyes. The mouth of a woman who had been kissed badly and beautifully and had bolted. She wrote the note at the desk, 3 drafts. She started one that said, "I'm sorry," and she crossed it out so hard the pen tore through the paper. She started another that said, "We need to talk," and she ripped it clean in half. In the end, she wrote 4 words in the careful handwriting her grandmother had drilled into her with a ruler when she was 8. "I need to breathe." She left it on the kitchen counter, weighted it down with a little copper saucer they had never actually used. She backed her car out of the garage at 5:32 in the morning. The gate opened slow. The city was still mostly dark, that pale grey edge of light behind the towers of Jardins, and the first bakers on her block were only just beginning to haul up their metal shutters. She turned onto Rua Oscar Freire with the heater on, her hands tight around the wheel, and drove. Campos de Jordão was 3 hours away. Her grandmother's house was an old stone cottage at the end of a long dirt road, buried in araucaria pines, with a chimney that smoked from October through August and a lawn that was always wet at sunrise. Sarah had spent every winter of her childhood in that house. She had learned to ride a bike on that lawn. She had cried on that porch the day her parents announced the divorce. She had hidden under the dining room table with a book the Christmas her father brought his new girlfriend around. And she had been the one, the only one of the cousins, willing to close the house up after her grandmother died 4 years ago. It was the only place on earth where no one expected her to be anyone in particular. She got there a little before 9. The cold slapped her the second she opened the car door. Campos did that in May. Dropped 20 degrees on you without warning. Thin mountain air, wet stone, pine. She unlocked the house, turned the lights on, pulled the dust sheets off the old leather furniture, lit the fire with matches and old newspaper the way her grandmother had taught her. 1 corner at a time, patient, no rushing it. Then she sat on the floor in front of the fireplace in her coat and didn't move for an hour. A series of small realizations came to her in a specific and unforgiving order. One she had been planning for 2 months, to destroy a man who, as far as his actual behavior was concerned around her in person, had not given her a single real reason. Her evidence amounted to 1 drunk sentence overheard through a half-open door. Arrogant woman. That was it. 2. She had heard over the last months 100 small things that contradicted that sentence. A jacket around her shoulders on a cold veranda. A hand that had held hers through a thunderstorm. A thumb across her cheekbone in the dark kitchen. She had refused systematically to let any of them count. 3. She was the one behaving like the villain in her own story, and she had been doing it so gracefully that she'd almost managed not to notice. 4. She had kissed him back. Twice. The second time hadn't been strategy. The cold little voice in the back of her head, the one that had been writing the plan since the night behind the half-open door, tried to speak up. She told it out loud into the empty room to shut up. She spent the rest of the day not answering her phone. 3 missed calls, 2 from him, 1 from her assistant. He didn't leave voicemails. He sent 1 text at 11. "Are you safe?" And when she didn't reply for 40 minutes, a second one. "Just answer that part." She finally wrote back, "Yes." Nothing else. He didn't push. She walked the pines in the afternoon, drank tea out on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the light go, fell asleep in the armchair by the fire with her grandmother's old wool throw across her knees. Meanwhile in São Paulo, Levi was standing in the kitchen with a 4-word note in his hand. He stood there a long time. He had woken at 6 to the sound of a car pulling out of the garage below his bedroom window, and he'd known, before his feet even hit the floor, who was driving it. He came downstairs barefoot, saw the note, read it, read it again, set it down, picked it up. "I need to breathe." He read it like a contract, looking for clauses. There weren't any. He went back upstairs, showered, stood in his closet for 10 minutes, staring at his shirts like he'd forgotten what shirts were for, called his assistant and told her to cancel everything, called his driver and told him he wouldn't be needed. He didn't eat. He drank 2 cups of coffee and poured a third one he forgot on the counter. Then, around 3 in the afternoon, after spending the entire morning telling himself he wasn't going to do exactly what he was about to do, he went into his study and pulled an old yellowed envelope from the back of a desk drawer, tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket and got in his car. He had not driven alone to Campos do Jordão in 11 years. The Monteiros didn't drive alone. There was always a driver, always a security car behind, always a schedule, always a call ahead. It was one of the 100 small rules he'd been raised inside of, and he'd never seriously questioned any of them. He broke all of them. Didn't tell security, didn't tell his mother. Left his phone on airplane mode in the cup holder. Took the old back road through the mountains his father had once sworn never to use. Slower, emptier. It started raining on the Serra da Mantiqueira. A thin, cold rain, and by the time he reached the turn-off to Campos, the rain had become mist, and the mist had become the kind of fog that closes the world down to the 10 meters in front of your hood. He stopped twice, once for coffee at a gas station where nobody recognized him, once on a hillside pullout, where he got out of the car and put both hands on the hood and stood there in the cold mist for a very long time, trying to work out, honestly, what he was going to say when she opened the door. He didn't work it out. By the time he reached the dirt road up to her grandmother's house, it was nearly dark. The sky had gone indigo. The cottage windows were small yellow squares in the black shape of the pines, and smoke was rising in a thin grey line from the chimney. He cut the engine at the end of the drive, sat with his hands on the steering wheel for a minute, took the envelope out of his jacket and laid it on his thigh. The envelope was 10 years old. The handwriting on it was his own, younger, more careful, less steady. It had lived in the back of a drawer for a decade, unsent. His hands, he noticed, were shaking. He got out of the car and started walking toward the front door. She heard the car before she saw it. Engines were rare up here. The dirt road that ran up to her grandmother's cottage dead-ended at the property line, and unless some lost tourist had taken a seriously wrong turn out of Capivari, nobody came down it. So when tires crunched in the gravel at the edge of the drive, Sarah's whole body locked up. She was at the sink rinsing a teacup. She set the cup down carefully, dried her hands on a towel she'd ironed twice as a girl, and crossed to the window. She already knew. Before she looked, he'd come. She watched him kill the engine, watched him sit there a minute with his head bowed over the wheel, watched him pull something out of his jacket and set it on his lap. The dome light was off. She couldn't see what it was. Just a rectangle, paler than him in the dark of the car. Her heart did what it had been doing for weeks, fast, then too slow, then nothing that had a rhythm to it at all. He got out. He walked up to the porch with his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets and his shoulders braced against the cold. The wooden stairs groaned under him. He stopped on the mat, lifted his hand, and then she saw this through the glass with a terrible, tender clarity. He dropped it again. He didn't knock. He just stood there, and after a second he pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead, like he was trying to decide what kind of man he was going to be when the door opened. So she opened it before he had to decide. Cold rushed in around him. His hair was damp from the mist. There were dark half-moons under his eyes and 3 days of stubble she had never seen on him. His jacket was wet at the shoulders. He looked suddenly like every careful thing he had ever been had cracked straight down the middle somewhere on the drive up. "Sarah, what are you doing here? I need to—" "You can't be here. I need you to read something." He held the envelope out. The edges had gone yellow. On the front, in a slanted, younger version of his handwriting, "Para Sarah." Not for Sarah Albuquerque, not her last name. Just her first, in a hand she wouldn't have recognized if she hadn't spent an afternoon staring at his signature on a contract. She took it. She hadn't meant to. Her fingers brushed his for a second, and she felt how cold his were. And she almost reached for the rest of him. She didn't. "Read it," he said. His voice had gone low. "Careful? Then decide if you want me to leave." She looked at him for a long moment, at the tired in his face, at the envelope in her hand, at the fog pressing up against the trees behind him. "Come inside. You're going to get sick." He came in. She shut the door. She walked past him toward the fireplace without telling him to follow, and she didn't offer him a drink, and she didn't offer him a chair. She sat on the floor in front of the fire, her back to him. The flames had burned low while she'd washed up. She nudged a log with the iron poker until they came up again, amber, breathing. Behind her she heard Levi stop in the middle of the living room. He didn't sit, didn't take his jacket off. He just stood there the way a man stands while a verdict is read. She slid her thumb under the flap of the envelope. 4 pages, folded twice. His handwriting, younger, neater, before whatever had made it harder later on. The ink had gone slightly brown in places. She smoothed the pages flat on her knees and started to read. "Sarah, I don't know if I'm going to send this. Probably not. I'm writing it because I was at the library today, and you were there too, and you were laughing at something with Marina Geddes, and you didn't see me, and I want to remember, for as long as I can, the way your face looks when you're not performing for anyone. It is the best face I have ever seen. We're 17. You don't know my name. You do, technically. Our fathers hate each other. Our mothers pretend to be friends at charity things. You know my name the way I know the names of all the people I'm supposed to know. But you have never looked at me for more than 4 seconds, and I have counted." She had to stop. She pressed her hand flat over her mouth and looked into the fire, and she could feel Levi behind her, unmoving, barely breathing, letting her have whatever she needed to have. She made herself go back to the page. "I've watched you for 4 years. Not in a way that should scare you. I mean, I've loved you from across rooms, from other tables at other dinners, from behind the shoulders of other people's girlfriends. I've watched you date boys who didn't deserve to touch your hand. I've watched you laugh at jokes that weren't funny because you wanted your mother to feel included. I've watched you be kinder to waiters than anyone in your family has ever been. And I've watched you be exactly as sharp as the people around you required. And I've loved you in every version. You'll probably never know. My family doesn't let me want what I want. Your family doesn't let you be what you are. We're both heirs, Sarah, and that's a kind of prison nobody has the decency to call a prison. But I want to put it down somewhere. I want, once, to say it, even if nobody reads it. I love you. I've loved you since the winter I was 14, at a dinner where you told my father very politely that he was wrong about something, and he laughed because you were young, and I laughed because nobody had ever told my father he was wrong about anything. I'll probably lose you in 100 small ways over the next 10 years. I'll watch you marry someone else. I'll watch you have children who aren't mine. I'll congratulate you at something eventually. Shake someone else's hand. I'd rather lose you in silence than lose you by saying it. L. She was crying before she got to the signature. She finished. Set the pages down on the rug in front of her. Careful, flat. Wiped her face with both hands, hard, a little angry at her own tears, and didn't turn around. Levi. Yes. 10 years. Yes. You wrote this 10 years ago. I wrote it when I was 17, Sarah. I was very dramatic. Don't. Okay. Don't make it a joke. Not this. She heard him breathe. Hold it. Let it go." Then she heard him move. He didn't walk over and pull her up. He didn't touch her. He crossed the room slow, and he knelt. Not next to her, in front of her, slightly off to the side, so she had to lift her face to see him. Close enough now that she could see the small brown flecks in his eyes that the dark had always hidden. "Sarah," his voice had gone very soft, very steady. "I'm not kneeling to ask you to marry me. We're, technically, already married." A small broken sound came out of her that might have been a laugh. "I'm kneeling to ask you to forgive me." "For what?" "For not saying it out loud when it would have mattered. For letting you hear, behind a door at a party, a sentence I didn't mean, because I'd been drinking and I was scared of what I actually felt and I was an idiot. For not fighting for you when I was 20. For letting them talk me into signing a contract with you instead of asking you out for coffee." "Levi, let me finish, please. I'll only say this once." She nodded. She couldn't speak. He took a breath. His hands rested on his knees, and she could see the white in his knuckles. "I loved you before you hated me," he said. "I loved you while you hated me. And I'm going to love you even if you decide to walk out of this house tonight and never speak to me again. That part isn't conditional. I'm telling you so you know, not so you owe me anything." The fire cracked. A log settled. She didn't look at it. She reached out slow and put her hands on either side of his face, her thumbs at his jaw. He closed his eyes the second she touched him, like a man who'd been cold for 10 years and had just walked inside. "You idiot," she whispered. Her voice cracked in 2 places. "You beautiful, proud, stubborn idiot. All these years." "I know. All these years, Levi. I know, Sarah. I know." She pulled him into her, and she cried into his shoulder, and for the first time in 12 years she didn't try to pretend that she wasn't. They stayed on the floor a long time. The fire worked its way through the log she'd nudged earlier, and the room slowly warmed in a way it hadn't been warm in days. His jacket still held a faint trace of cold mountain air. She had her face tucked somewhere near his collarbone, and at some point his hand started moving, slow, careful circles against her back through the thick wool of her sweater, like he was reassuring himself she was really there, or asking her not to leave. She pulled back eventually to look at him. His eyes were red. She hadn't expected that. "You drove up here alone." "I did." "You never drive alone." "No." "Did you tell your security?" "No." "Levi, I didn't want anyone else on the road with me tonight, Sarah. I wouldn't have known what to say to them." She laughed, a small wet laugh, and ran the side of her thumb along the stubble on his jaw. He hadn't shaved. He looked 5 years older and 10 years younger at the same time, and she registered in a distant way that she was going to remember exactly what he looked like at this precise second for the rest of her life. "I have to tell you something," she said. "Okay. You're not going to like it." "Okay." She took a breath. She couldn't not tell him. She knew that now. "I heard you, that night, at the gala, behind the study door. I heard you tell them you'd rather go bankrupt than marry me, and I went back out into the ballroom and I decided I was going to make you fall in love with me, and then I was going to destroy you." She watched his face. He didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. He just looked at her for a long second with something very soft around his mouth and said, "I know." "You... what?" "Sarah, I know." "How could you possibly..." "Because I know you." He touched her wrist, lightly. "Because that's what I would have done. Because you're the only person I've ever been afraid of, and I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean, your attention has always felt like weather. I've always felt you coming into a room." She stared at him. "I was awful to you. You were extraordinary to me. Levi, I'm not joking. You were the most awake I felt in 10 years. You made me remember I had a pulse." She didn't have anything for that. She dropped her forehead against his shoulder and shook her head. "Because what do you say to a man who has been watching you for a decade and is somehow grateful you tried to ruin him?" "I don't deserve you," she said into his jacket. "Sarah, I don't." "Then we're even. I sat in a boardroom full of my friends and called you arrogant so nobody would guess I'd been rehearsing your name in my head for 11 years. We can be undeserving together if you want. We can make a whole thing of it." She laughed into his shoulder. Properly. The kind of laugh she hadn't let out in a very long time. They ended up staying at the cottage 7 days. Nothing about it was planned. The first night, he fell asleep in the armchair across from her, and she pulled a blanket over him and didn't wake him up. The second morning, they walked out into the pines in matching ridiculous coats and drank coffee on the porch, while the fog lifted off the trees in slow white sheets. On the third day, they drove into Capivari and bought bread from the little bakery where her grandmother had bought bread for 30 years, and the woman behind the counter squinted at Sarah and said, "You're the Albuquerque girl," and Sarah said, "Yes," and reached for Levi's hand in front of her for the first time. The woman's eyes dropped to their fingers. She smiled. She slipped an extra pain de queijo into the bag and waved off the extra change. They talked about everything. About his father, who had been harder on him than he'd ever admitted to anyone. About her mother, who had taught her to smile before she'd taught her to speak. About the cousins they couldn't stand and the ones they loved. About the brother in Lisbon, who Levi missed more than he'd realized until he said it out loud. About a mutt Sarah had had in middle school and never told anyone about. About a wedding 6 years ago, a cousin of hers, where Levi had watched her dance with someone else and had left in the middle without saying goodbye to the groom because he couldn't stand another second of it. They cooked badly. They fought over music. He discovered, genuinely horrified, that she had never seen Cidade de Deus. She discovered that he had never, in 31 years of life, made a pot of arroz con feijão without a cook within shouting distance. They burned a pan. They laughed so hard the neighbor's dog started barking up the hill. On the 4th night by the fire, he kissed her again. Slower this time, no urgency in it, the way a man kisses someone he is going to wake up next to in the morning. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't." She said it anyway. On the 7th morning, they rolled up the contract and fed it to the fire. She had been driving that thing around São Paulo in her glove compartment for 2 months without letting herself acknowledge it was there. It took about 20 seconds to catch. The paper curled at the edges first, then went black, then cracked open like a mouth, and every careful clause in it turned to ash. 2 years, amicable separation, joint address, termination by mutual consent. Ash, ash, ash. Then he went over to the small writing desk by the window, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, uncapped a pen, and wrote a single line in his careful adult handwriting. "For as long as you want." He slid the page across the table to her. She looked at him for a long moment, uncapped the pen, wrote beneath his line in the handwriting her grandmother had drilled into her with a ruler when she was 8, "For the rest of our lives, you idiot." She signed her name. Clean. The small loop at the end of the H. He signed below hers. They drove back to São Paulo the following afternoon with that single folded page where the old contract had lived. The city was exactly where they had left it. The same traffic on the Rodovia Presidente Dutra. The same skyline smudged into the haze. The same tangle of obligations waiting at the other end. The board meetings, the press, the 2 old families who were going to have a great deal to say. But somewhere between Campos do Hordo and the first toll plaza, Sarah reached across the console and put her hand over his on the gear shift, and he laced his fingers through hers without ever taking his eyes off the road. And she understood, all the way through, that they weren't coming home as the same people who had left. Not Montero and Albuquerque, not heirs, not a merger. 2 people who had finally chosen each other. Not out of duty, not out of revenge, just chosen, against every rule their fathers had ever bothered to write down. It turned out love wasn't the weakness the Monteros and the Albuquerques had spent 3 generations calling it. It was the one thing, in the end, that no empire could buy, sign for, contract, or take away from them. And in the car, as São Paulo came up through the haze in the late afternoon light, Sarah Montero leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes, and for the first time in her entire, elegant, carefully engineered life, she wasn't performing for anyone. In the end, Sarah didn't destroy him. She let him see her, and in the seeing she was seen back. Some wars are only won when you put the weapon down. Some loves were already written long before we noticed the ink. Could it be that what we call revenge is only a love we were too afraid to name? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence means the world to us.